Hey, I'm Kevin, and today I'm going to show you how we cut down a tree and made this farmhouse style table in the KevBot workshop. This is Joe. Joe is building a house, but before Joe can have his house built, he has to have some trees removed from his land. Since there's going to be some free trees for lumber, Joe had an idea that he could make a table from those trees. So he called me and asked if we can team up and build a farmhouse table together. Since we know all the surrounding neighbors already, we have some footage from tree to table on this project.
Whoa!
After the trees were down, I went over with Joe to see what was usable and to seal up the ends with hopes of having less checking as they dried out. Now Joe doesn't have years to wait for this wood to dry out, so he had a couple of these logs sent to a mill where they were cut and then dried out in a kiln. Once they were dried, Joe and I worked on a quick project to prep a large piece to turn it into a mantle over his fireplace. This was not much work, but it did let Joe dip his feet into woodworking before we got started on a big build. Joe doesn't have the experience to build something like this, so it made sense to call me up because I have the tools and the knowledge to teach him. Plus it helps to have an assistant on this one because it's the largest project I have ever worked on. There is one caveat to this build. We only have 5 days to build this table. Typically I build projects at my own speed, which is done when I have free time. But if we were to build this together, trying to line up our schedules, this project would never get done. I have another reason why, but that's information for another video in the future. The project started in my workshop where I got to work on marking out what pieces we would use, and luckily we had just enough if we used cutoffs from the fireplace mantle. With all the pieces roughly marked, I can start breaking down the lumber into more manageable pieces. We are working with pretty thick stock. While the tree was going to be milled, we requested 10 and 16/4 boards so that we will have enough stock for thick legs and top. Because of the thickness, most cuts were done halfway before flipping the board over and cutting the rest of the way through. After they get surfaced, it will be easier to cut all the way through. We didn't have enough thick stock for all the pieces of the leg and stretcher, so I had to break down some of the other stock to glue them together.
We're actually going to get these gift bags to the venue before they close. Thank you, Terry. Don't thank me. Do not see these.
Now that we have all the rough pieces we need, I can start surfacing them on the joiner. These smaller pieces were no problem, but luckily Joe showed up in time to help me with the larger pieces for the top. Before we did anything, we laid out all the pieces and marked where we can rough cut them. I know I mentioned this before, but just having an extra set of hands here was great because I normally do this on my own and I struggle with moving and feeding large boards. Plus I have a shop hand to clean up all the wood shavings after. Normally when surfacing lumber I will do 4 sides, but with this, due to the size and wanting to save on material, we just edge jointed so that we can join the boards together. Luckily these boards were relatively flat already, but we used dowels for alignment just in case. I learned from my mistake with my TV stand to line up the dowels from the underside. Having Joe around means a couple of things. I can use some of my videographer skills to get some better shots, and he can work on things while I work on another. Here he drilled holes for dowels and I started gluing up boards in segments. We won't do the final glue up until we have it back at Joe's house so we don't have to move a massive top. The next day was mostly light. I got to work on final surfacing for the legs and stretcher. With all the pieces jointed in plane, I can now cut them down to size. In the evening, Joe and I transported the pieces for the top. Like I said before, we figured it would be much easier to do the final glue up at his place, and this was definitely the right choice because the final top was big and heavy. We glued up the top some more in segments. Luckily, I had enough clamps to do both of these glue ups. And that's definitely got to be a woodworking first, you know, because they say you can never have too many clamps. After letting that dry, we did the final glue up. To have the clamps long enough, you'll see how we doubled some of them up to have them reach across. Nice. To start day 3, I got to work on cutting angles needed for the table base. All the angles were the same here, and I can't remember what degree they were, but when they were all done, I laid out the legs to start marking for the joinery. We didn't have enough stock to do joinery like mortise and tenon or half-lap joints, so these will be going together with glue and dowels. Before we assembled the legs, we sanded all the pieces because it's easier to do them separately. To help with the glue up, I saved some of the angled cutoffs so that the clamps can hold without slipping. Just like with the top, we brought all the pieces over to Joe's before the final glue up for easier mobility. We began day 4 with the final glue up of the base.
Terry loves yogurt.
While the glue dried, we started working on flattening the top. In hindsight, it might have been easier to find a workshop with a wide belt sander large enough for the top. But this is Joe's first build. What better way to introduce him to woodworking than by having him do a long, tedious process of flattening a top with a router sled. This was such a long process because the white oak or ash, I'm not quite sure what wood species this is. If you think you know what it is, let me know in the comments. Anyways, this oak or ash was so hard that cutting through that much wood to make it flat made it nearly impossible without burning out the router. So we had to do this in a couple of passes, which made the process longer. This is at 2000 speed, so you can imagine how long it took. Not to mention it was rough on our backs and knees. Rather than doing another pass on the bottom, we settled with basically skip planing the underside to save some of the thickness. We really just needed to be flat, and that was flat enough to take out any twist or cup there might be. While Joe worked on the next pass of router planing, I reinforced the leg base with some Spax power lags. While I was at it, I also drilled some holes for attaching the top to the base. Since the table will expand and contract, I widened the holes to allow movement with seasonal changes. With the planing done, we can trim up the tabletop to its final size. Before we can finish, we need to make sure that the top stays flat. To prevent it from cupping, we are going to inset some C-channel that I cut, drilled, and painted myself. At this point, we were already cutting it close to finish up, but then we ran into an issue while cutting the recesses for the C-channel. I said earlier that this oak is pretty hard wood.
So we're down to the wire. We're not gonna finish tonight, but we're gonna get real close. And then the bit broke. Joe's gonna go and get another bit. And we're gonna see if we can wrap this up. Okay. Sheesh.
So we broke that bit, and I didn't show you, but also damaged a larger surfacing bit. So this table is pretty solid, but it has done some real work on all my tools. After we got the new bit, we were able to finish the recesses and install the C-channel. We then can flip the top and see the table for the first time.
It's not centered, but
Yeah. It's a table.
it's a freaking table.
With the table all assembled, we are just about at the end of this project. You can see there's a decent amount of sanding that needs to be done to remove the markings from the router, and this is a void that Joe will fill with epoxy. But that's where I'm checking out on this project, as we were out of time and I couldn't be there to finish up. I did leave Joe with instructions on how to sand and finish though. And now all that's left is some of that sweet, sweet B-roll. If you have any questions about this build, leave it in the comment section down below. If you like this project and you want to see more like it, hit that like and subscribe button. In the meantime, I'll have a couple more loaded up for you right over here. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in the KevBot Workshop. There we go. Cut it. Call it a day. Wrap it up.